Hi everyone. So hopefully by this point you've had a chance both to watch our lecture where we unpack a lot of what's going on in this diagram and gotten a chance to look a little bit more closely at some of the different species and life and ecological communities of the Colorado Front Range through the vegetation tour that I've put together. This is just a brief video that I wanted to use as a recap of some of what we've seen and as a chance to look ahead toward what we'll be talking about in Module 8, where we're looking a lot more closely at ecosystem disturbance and recovery. So this is a slide I've talked about quite a bit before. I just want to remind us that what we're looking at in terms of life zones is a shorthand for all of the interactions that are going on in mountain ecosystems. That even though there are all sorts of complex interactions between biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystems, we're using life zones as a way of distilling that down to the influence of climate and elevation. And using that as a way of sort of bootstrapping ourselves or building up a schema of life zones where we're thinking about both the canonically defined lower montane and upper montane and subalpine zones, but also looking at the elevations at which they occur, and at a number of key forest communities that almost but don't entirely line up with these different life zones. So we spent a good chunk of Lecture 7.2 unpacking this diagram and thinking about all of the different processes that are reflected in these. Looking at, for instance, the role of altitudinal zonation, looking at the difference between mesic north-facing and xeric south-facing slopes, looking at the way that particular tree species overlap the life zone boundaries that we're sort of trying to accommodate to the actual real-world conditions of the Northern Front Range, and looking even beyond that at how tree species get distributed even within particular life zones or ecological communities. Even so, this still should be recognizably pretty similar to the model of altitudinal zonation that we've been playing with for quite a while. So particularly, hopefully, you can now see the influence of 6 key life zones that I want you to understand, 3 of which we're paying particular attention to because they're where forests happen, looking at 3 key lines, even though those lines tend to be fuzzy when you look at them up close, and adding in the concept of slope aspect, which shifts this nice horizontal layer cake of a model into something that looks a little bit more tilted, like we see here. Within that, there are a number of different communities and species I'd like you to be familiar with. So, going in order from lowest to highest, looking at the plains and the grasslands, area where there are few trees, if any, growing because there's not much moisture. Looking at a lower ecotone that's dominated by fairly spread out ponderosa pine, occurring where moisture starts to be present in large enough quantities to support tree growth. Moving upwards from the lower ecotone into the lower montane forest, where we see communities based on ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. Ponderosas preferring the more xeric environments, Doug firs preferring the more mesic. A lot of that ponderosa pine continuing up into the upper montane, but also in the upper montane encountering somewhat more mixed conifer forest, where we start to see a lot more overlap between the ponderosas and Doug fir that we see at lower elevations, the lodgepoles that we see at higher elevations, as well as other species like the Colorado blue spruce or the quaking aspen. As we move into the upper parts of the upper montane, seeing a lodgepole pine forest, where there is a really dominant presence of lodgepole pine, kept in place by the relationship between lodgepoles and fire, and that occupying both the upper reaches of the upper montane as well as the lower subalpine zone. You can see it's distinguished here as part of the subalpine, but we often see this in the upper montane as well. The higher elevations within the subalpine being composed of spruce and fir forest, that being the Engelmann spruce and the subalpine fir. Looking at some of the Krummholz that might occur at what might otherwise look like the upper tree line, sort of a transition within a few hundred vertical feet between solid timber and alpine tundra. And so seeing that crooked, gnarled wood that's growing right at the upper limits of tree growth, that's also really composed of the same species that would find in the subalpine, but not looking necessarily too much like trees. And finally getting up to the alpine tundra, where no trees are growing at all. We could even push that a little bit further. We could look up into a Nevel zone, though that isn't really something that we find very extensively in Colorado. We could look at the fact that even on the bare rocks of some summits, you'll still find life growing, even if that's just some lichen growing on a rock. But these are the species that I'm really hoping you've had a chance to have a look at, and that you are pretty familiar with by this point. And of course they fit into, if not the simplest of charts, at least a chart that helps you to understand all of these relationships. However, it's never that simple. So one thing to note is that even though this gives a pretty good guide as to where you'll find these different ecological communities, weird things can happen. Just as a case in point, as I was driving through Rocky Mountain National Park looking for a good place to film some lodgepole forest for you guys, I ended up pulling off at picnic grounds called Hidden Valley. That's actually a pretty prominent backcountry skiing destination if you're familiar. It used to be Ski Estes Park. But I thought that was in about the exact right location to get some lodgepoles. I pull off, take a look, and all I can find are Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, despite being at an elevation where I would expect to see lodgepole pine forest. Turns out I was looking at a very, very well-shaded north-facing slope, and those subalpine trees were growing at a lower elevation than I would otherwise expect. But just as a reminder, occasionally you will see flukes, occasionally you will see weird stuff that doesn't entirely fit into the model. Take a deep breath and remember that the trees don't know how to read and they don't know how to look at charts. But even if we discard some of those flukes, we can point out that there are some other ways in which this neat march of forests and life zones starts to get a little bit more broken up in a number of cases. One of these deals with meadows and wetlands and lakes that we'll often find in the montane and subalpine zones, places where we might otherwise expect to see forested growth, but instead we're seeing non-forests. Wetlands and lakes are particularly important. They're the source of a lot of the biodiversity, both in plant terms and animal terms, that we find in mountains. Especially, these provide some crucial habitats for a lot of birds, a lot of animals, even a lot of insects and fish that we wouldn't necessarily see in the more forested regions. Oftentimes these meadows will gradually fill in, or excuse me, these wetlands and lakes will gradually fill in and dry out over time, thus giving us a lot of our mountain meadows. But in some cases these meadows are a lot more extensive, giving us, for instance, some of the beautiful flowers that we might see during some nice seasons of the year. So it's important to realize that not all of mountains are forested or fall neatly into these life zones. There are some other things going on, largely as a result of the role of water. Another set of things that can happen deal with disturbances. So a lot of these life zones, even though we might often see them dominated by particular tree species that might give us a signature to what's happening are also in processes of ongoing change, of ongoing plant succession. So some species, after a disturbance happens, after something like an avalanche comes through and knocks down a lot of the trees, or a forest fire burns established forest, leaving plant communities to basically restart themselves, we'll see a series of different plant successions. Some species starting up and really specializing in being pioneers, uh, reestablishing themselves pretty quickly in disturbed areas. Others succeeding those initial pioneer species, moving towards what might once have been described as a more climax species. These days we think of that a lot more in terms of an ongoing process of succession. And so that ultimately reminds us that even though we've talked about a lot of these forest zones as being dominated by a few key tree species, in fact, there's a lot more potential for some of these trees to grow outside of the areas we've described them in, and to fall into that scheme of succession. That means that we're able to see frequently, because of these disturbances, a lot more diversity than just looking at that chart would suggest to us. But it also suggests that we might want to pay particularly close attention to some of these patterns, or to some of these processes that disturb or upset the species living in a particular area. How do some of these disturbances behave? What do they do in terms of time, in terms of space? Are these things that recur frequently or happen only once in a while? And how do these ecological communities respond and recover? We'll be looking at that in a lot more detail in Module 8. Thanks.